Hello and welcome to this revision session for L4M8 Procurement and Supply in Practice. We're effectively going to go through the learning outcomes, have a look at the content that you might need to know and think about some of the potential questions and how we might go about answering those potential questions. So we'll start by looking at learning outcome 1, which is to demonstrate an application of the procurement cycle. Effectively, do you know all the jobs that procurement have to do throughout their role in ensuring that we're meeting the business and organisational needs? We're going to have to look at understanding the application of the procurement cycle. In particular, they would like us to know the application of the SIPS procurement cycle. So, as it's a learning outcome, as we know that the questions that they can ask can only be derived from the learning outcomes, it's really important to know that we're going to focus in on this SIPS procurement cycle, which has 13 stages, which we're going to see in a second. It's much more likely, however, that they will condense down a question to look at some of these key overviewing topics within the procurement cycle. So the idea of defining the need, market analysis and testing, supplier evaluation, tendering processes, and supplier and stakeholder management. So let's start by going through each of those and the kind of things that they might ask. So effectively, the procurement cycle is all the things that we need to do to make sure that our organisation is getting the inputs to be able to meet its organisational output requirements. So there's lots of different things that all of the buyers in the UK or all the buyers around the world are going to be buying. And they are generally to meet the organisational needs, and that might be physical goods or it might be services, which are intangible items. But effectively, the procurement cycle is going to take effect, and we're going to follow this process no matter what we're buying, whether it be fixed assets or current assets, capex, opex. What I'm trying to say is that the procurement cycle, it doesn't matter what you're buying, this is what we're going to be following. So let's start by going through each of these points. So the first thing that you might get questions on is defining the business need. Now, effectively defining the business need covers a couple of main criteria, a couple of main things that we're going to need to know about. The first one is about identifying the need and understanding what an organisation actually requires. And as I've just said, that's mainly going to be about making sure you've got the inputs to meet your organisational output requirements. So if you guys are a manufacturing organisation, then it's likely that you're going to be buying the raw material and the production materials that are going to be required to make whatever you're manufacturing. If you're a larger organisation who has to facilitate the organisation operations in a much wider scale, you might be buying things like insurance services, or you might be buying facilities management services, or you might be buying HR services, and there might be a lot of services that you're buying. And it's really important to us to understand when we're identifying that need that we understand what it is we actually want and how we actually want it. It's very much our job in procurement to make sure that at every stage we are adding value, that we are making sure that we are getting exactly what the organisation needs. It's really important that lots of the questions that you'll get will have this terminology. How can it add value? How can it make the organisation better? Any question that you get that has value or added value in, you should have been pre-programmed in your revision to make sure you think, right, well, value is the worth of something. That's what Michael Porter said. He said, value is the worth of something. It's the difference between what we pay and what somebody's willing to pay for something. And that's really important, because once we get that concept into our head, any added value question becomes a lot simpler. Because you can say, if it says, how does X, Y, or Z add value? Well, the output of your question should always be, well, the value that it would be added would be either something that reduces down the costs or makes it more attractive. So what kind of things can add value in regards to reducing down the cost? Well, when we talk about reducing down the cost, we actually talk about two things. We talk about reducing down costs and we talk about reducing down prices. Prices are what we actually pay a supplier for goods. And there are a number of ways we can reduce down prices. We can reduce down prices by getting better economies of scale, by standardizing or rationalizing our supply base so that we are spending more money with a particular supplier. That increased economy of scale will help us to drive down prices. We might be able to reduce down the prices of goods by more effective negotiation. We might be able to reduce down the price of goods by building stronger relationships with suppliers. All of these things are the cause. The effect is the added value. So whenever you get a question that says, how would X, Y, or Z add value? I would expect you guys to go, well, by building better relationships, which is going to be the cause, will lead to the added value of reduction of timeframes, reduction of costs, etc. So it's really important when you're answering your question that you understand what the cause and effect is, and the examiner will be looking for that you've not just said, oh, it'll save money, because that doesn't really mean anything. That's the effect, but what caused it? And your job in procurement is to understand those causes so that you can better act on that to have a more beneficial results for your organisation. So, go back. The ways that we can add value is reducing down prices by better negotiation, by building relationships, by betting economies of scale. We can also reduce down costs, and we can reduce down costs in a number of ways. We can reduce down costs by looking at our inventory costs and holding less inventory. We can look at reducing down waste in our process by stripping out things that we maybe don't need in our specifications, by getting rid of additional administrative costs, or getting rid of any additional acquisition costs or procurement costs. So when we think about what we can do to add value, one of the ways is to reduce down what we're paying, and that's twofold: prices and costs. Okay, and that can be achieved in a number of ways, which we'll talk about as we go through. The other way that we can add value, other things should be the effect of the end point of our why we're saying this will add value, would be to make it more attractive to a customer. Now, we make things more attractive to a customer fairly simplistically, really. It's the same things that adds value to us as consumers. It'll be the same for our customers within our organisation. And don't forget, those customers don't have to be external, your end, the customers that you're selling to. It might be internal customers that you are getting things for. When you think about, if you're a manufacturer, a lot of the times the products you're buying them to make sure that your production team can operate effectively. So when you're thinking about adding value, it doesn't have to be to the end user, the customer you're selling to. It might be within your own organisation. But we might add value, make it more attractive. Well, common sense things like if we can get it quicker, that often will make it more attractive. How do we do things like that in procurement? Well, we do things like by making sure that we get the product right first time, that our specifications correct. We might work and build relationships with suppliers so they've got a better forecast, and that might add value by reducing down time frames. It might be that we improve the quality of a product by working with a supplier. And quality is a number of things. Quality doesn't just have to be how long it lasts for. It might be the look, the feel. It might even be that it's just exactly what the customer wants. If we can work with our suppliers maybe to make sure we streamline our products so it's exactly what the customer wants, then that might add value to the customer. It might be by introducing innovation, building and working, providing things to our customers that makes it more attractive to them because it's more innovative. It's things they didn't even know that they wanted. It's more efficient, more effective. Okay, so innovation can add value. So we've got timescales, quality, innovation. Might be more common sense things. For a lot of organisations, particularly those in the public sector, it might be things like social value, or being more socially responsible, or more environmentally friendly. We often talk about increasing the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. This idea that if we can make it more attractive to the social aspects, those people, are we using sustainable sources of labour, where we're not using child labour and forced labour and all the things like modern slavery we'll talk about later on in these learning outcomes. It might be that we are being more socially responsible, that we're getting our suppliers to upskill their workers by bringing in apprentices or putting in training programs as part of the tendering process that we're asking for them to do. It might be, so that's the people, it might be the planet that we're asking them to add value towards. And it might be, using recycled materials or renewables, or reducing down their carbon footprint, or using carbon offsetting, doing things like reverse logistics. So all of these things can add value. So I'm talking about this now because a lot of the questions that we'll get will, how will X, Y, or Z add value? So if we can always kind of have the effect, well, it might save us money, it might reduce down our inventory costs, it might make it more attractive, it might reduce down timescales, quality. Those are the end points. So when we talk about things like maybe defining the business need, the idea of making sure that we understand exactly what the customer wants or exactly what our organization wants, that's going to help us add value. Why? Because it'll mean that we might get it right first time, and that's going to save time, and that's the added value. It might mean that we have a better understanding of what our customer wants, and that's going to maybe make it seem like it's a better perception of quality, and that's going to add value. Okay. So how do we identify the need then? So we identify the need in a number of ways in a procurement department. The first way we might add value to a procurement department by identifying the need, or the first way we might identify the need, should I say, is that we might use a requisition. Now, a requisition is a really common thing within most businesses, and it's just a request for something, and these can be written down, and they can be what we call physical requisitions, or they can be electronic requisitions. It's really important that you guys know what the contents of a requisition might be. It's a question that they've asked before, and if it is, it's a no-brainer and a nice easy one to revise for. So when we send a requisition, the requisition will usually have and include details like the description of the goods that the user wants, the quantity of the goods, the date it's needed by, the delivery address, maybe the specification if that it's something that we've bought before. So we just need to know some of those key details of what would go into a requisition. One of the common mistakes I've seen quite a lot as a marker on papers with this question on is that people will generally put a price. Now, a price generally won't be on a requisition because we haven't gone to the market, we haven't asked suppliers yet. There might be a guide price or a budget price, but generally a price will not be on there, and it's a common mistake that you generally won't get marks for. What would be on there though would be a budget code or a cost center to say where the cost for this will be attributed to within our budget maybe. Okay, so defining the need, it might be a requisition. It might be a straight system that a inventory system or a stock system that identifies this need. So lots of organisations will have an MRP system, a materials requirement planning, and effectively all that does is it looks at what we're forecasted to sell or forecasted to use in production or forecasted to need. It looks at what we've got in stock. It looks at what we might have on back order, and it does the numbers and it says, right, this is what we're going to need. And a lot of the guys who maybe work in materials management or inventory control will use systems very similar to that. So one way of identifying the need might be a MRP system, a materials requirement planning system. Okay. If you're in a public sector role, or you're in a role where you have rolling contracts or contracts that change over a 2 to 5 year period, it might be just the contract timings might be the identification of the need. You've got a contract that's coming to an end, and therefore it needs to be re-tendered. So that might be a way of identifying the need. Okay. So when we talk about defining the need, we often talk about identifying it, and we also talk about specifying it. So one of the key things that we should do as a procurement professional is not to just take as read that we are going to accept somebody telling us what they need. So often when we get a requisition, we might have to do our due diligence, check that it's got all the right dates, it's got all the right information, all the right terminology, it's got the right budget code, it's got, everything that we need before we actually accept it. I mean, we don't have to accept a requisition. We might just accept it. We might send it through. We might do an RFQ or something like that, a basic, but we could reject it and send it back to the end user, or sorry, to where the requisition has come from, the requester. Now, our job in procurement is to challenge what somebody tells us they need. And that job of challenging it, that generally comes through the creation of a specification. So the fact that we've got a learning outcome, a bullet point that talks about defining the business need, knowing historically the kind of questions they've asked about defining the need, it will be either something about why is it really important that we identify the need correctly, or it might be something around why it's important that we develop specifications. And developing specifications is really important because it makes sure we challenge what we need. Now, there's three general things that we talk about why specifications are really, really important. One of them is to make sure that we go through that tick box exercise, that we sit down with our end users, we sit down with the stakeholders and make sure we're getting exactly what the business needs. So that's number one. The second thing is it makes sure that we can communicate clearly and effectively to our suppliers exactly what we want. So it's a clear and definite understanding of what we need and making sure that we are fairly and transparently telling suppliers in a consistent way what we need. The third thing is that why we really important that we define the need correctly is that it's going to act at the end of the process as a way of making sure that we're getting exactly what we need. So if we've asked for some frozen baguettes and in the specification it says 36 in a box, then it's really important that when we get to the delivery stage where the goods are coming in, that we can check whether there's 36 in a box. And if there isn't, then we can go back and say, look, the specification said this, and it should help us reduce down arguments and reduce down any issues that we might have with the supplier. It gives us that really good measuring stick, yardstick to check we're getting what we wanted. So the three things that we generally talk about that are great about developing a spec: make sure that we go through the process and that tick box of understanding what we need, make sure that we've got a clear way of communicating that need, and then the third point is making sure we can measure whether or not we're getting what we asked for. Okay. Whenever we talk about specifications, it's really important that you guys know that the general overriding two different types of specifications. Those are performance and conformance. Performance specifications, also known as output specifications or functional specifications, and these effectively give a supplier a much wider berth of asking them to use their innovation, their capability to solve a problem that we have. We effectively say we want the product to do a particular thing. I always use the example of a waterproof coat. So if I say to a supplier it has to be a waterproof coat, I don't care how they make it waterproof, I just need it to be waterproof. And I might not be the expert, I might not have the technical knowledge, I might not have the time to research these things. I might not want to put the risk onto myself. If I say I want it to have a particular coating and it's not waterproof, then that's my fault. So whenever we talk about performance spec, we talk about it being a functional or an output spec. We say to the supplier exactly what we want it to do. A conformance spec, on the other hand, also known as an input spec or a technical spec. These include things like blueprints, technical drawings, brands, samples. Whenever we say we want a particular thing, that restricts down the supplier's ability to innovate or to get creative, and it puts more control over what we're asking for. So instead of saying a waterproof coat, if I said I wanted a trespass hunter's jacket, which is a very specific type of jacket, then the supplier has no capability to change or adapt or be innovative. Problem with that is that if I say I want a trespass hunter's coat or whatever, I made that up by the way, don't start googling it, a trespass hunter's coat, then I'm only going to be able to go to trespass for that coat. Because generally, the moment we start using conformance specs, we start to shrink down the supplier base, whereas performance specifications tend to widen the supply base. So it's just really important. Historically, when they've asked questions around defining the need in the old syllabus, they did ask questions around specifications, the two different types, maybe the 5 benefits of using a performance specification. If you got a question that said, what are the 5 benefits of using a performance specification, you would say things like, it puts the risk onto the supplier, because if I ask for a waterproof coat and it's not waterproof, that's their fault. You would say it means that the buyer doesn't have to have as much technical knowledge because you're relying on the technical knowledge of the supplier. It means that you get to use the innovative and creative capabilities of your suppliers. It means that it speeds up the process. It can reduce down the time and the cost and the effort of actually creating a specification. And it also means that we can widen the supply base because it means that we've got more suppliers that we can ask. So there's 5. They also might ask you 3 reasons, which was a very common question in the old syllabus. Whether or not they'll repeat that, but it might be worth knowing. 3 reasons why you'd use a conformance spec. Well, if you're the expert, you'd ask for exactly what you think you'll need. If you're somebody who works in research and development, you're leading the field in what you do, it's very unlikely that you're going to ask for somebody to get you something that you might have known more about. It might be a specific need. If you've got a printer, you're going to ask for a very specific printer cartridge to fit that requirement. If you are driven by your customer, and the customer, you work in a hotel and the customer says they want Heinz baked beans, well, you're going to have to use a conformance spec to your suppliers because you are being driven by your customer's needs. So there's lots of reasons why we'd use those different types of specifications. Okay, so when we talk about defining the need, it's about identifying it and then truly defining it, which is when we're talking about developing specifications. Okay, the next area, learning outcome topic, is market analysis and testing. So market testing is an incredibly important thing to do. As a buyer, we can test the market in a number of ways. Effectively, they might ask you a question like, how would you source the market, or how would you go about finding new suppliers, what's available, how would you start understanding what's going on in your marketplace? If you got that question, you would say, well, there's a number of ways that a buyer could go and research the market. You could use your own historic database. So you could look at things that you've historically bought, the suppliers you've historically used, any trends that you might recognize about pricing or products. You might be able to get information about forecasts. So your own historic database might be one. The internet, the great old Google, is a great way of sourcing information around the market, what's going on. There's loads of different websites specifically for lots of industries that we work in. There's if you work in commodities and you're buying things like from the dairy markets, there's a website called Dairyco that consolidates lots of information around the dairy markets, things like milk yields and things like that. Great, really great read, guys. Always enjoy. So there might be the internet that you'll find information. It might be going to conferences or networking events or exhibitions. Those are a really good way of collecting information around the market. Other ways that we can collect information around the marketplace might be things like asking experienced buyers around you, networking internally within your organisation, asking other buyers. It might be that you guys go to trade journals and you look at your industry press, or you look at suppliers marketing to get market information. So market information is available, and it's a common question that they've asked historically in the old syllabus, but it might be something that we can make sure that we can hone in on. So there are other ways to do a market analysis. So that's collecting information, but we can also use tools of analysis that can help us really understand what's going on in our marketplace. The 3 tools that I generally like to talk about, you're not going to be able to do 1,000 in the exam, so I generally like to pick out a few of things that I'm going to talk about if I know I'm going to get a question on something like a market analysis tool. Often called as well market environment tools, just for a terminology sake. So if you're going to talk about market analysis tools, you're going to talk about, generally for me, talk about my business internally, and I might talk about a SWOT analysis. What are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats that my organization is facing looking at the market that I'm approaching. So do I have resources, skills, the capabilities? Some of my weaknesses that I have a large organization which is difficult to maneuver, we can't be adaptive and dynamic? What are the opportunities? What do we think is going to happen in the external environment? And what are the threats in the external environment? If you do a SWOT analysis, really important to know that strengths and weaknesses are things that are internal to your business. And generally we say that if they are things that are shared by your other competitors in your marketplace, we try and ignore them because they're not really strengths or weaknesses if everybody is experiencing that. And then opportunities and threats are very much what we talk about in the external environment, things that we can't control. So once you've got your SWOT analysis done about your business, then you might look at your industry, the competitive environment in which you operate. Here you're going to talk about Porter's 5 forces. Now, the fact that there's a learning outcome that says market analysis, the fact that in the old syllabus, whenever they talked about market analysis, they often talked about Porter's 5 forces and used to give questions that effectively just broke down and said, describe these forces in the marketplace. And they talked about Porter's 5 forces, and they said, explain what is meant by the competitive rivalry, explain what is meant by the threat of new entrants, explain what is meant by the threat of substitutes, explain what is meant by the buyer power and the supplier power. So there has been questions historically that have asked about how you go about doing the market analysis. Remember, Porter's 5 forces is about the industry we operate in. So it's very specific to us. How many other buyers, suppliers, how many other alternatives are there to the things that in that industry or in that competitive environment? Okay, so really important we talk about those. And I've got a slide later on where I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about Porter's 5 forces. So once we've looked at our industry, well, what about the big bad world? What we call the macro environment. So Porter's 5 forces, we talk about our industry, and we call that the micro environment because it's small and it's related to us. When we talk about steepled, we talk about the big bad world, the macro environment. Whenever we talk about the macro environment, we talk about the things that affect every organization. Not just ours, not just people who are in healthcare, not just people who are in manufacturing, but everybody. So what are those big factors that affect everybody? So we generally talk about steepled things like the economic factors. So the fact that things that affect everybody, exchange rates, interest rates, inflation. And it's not hard to see, particularly in the world that we live in today, with things that have happened with the political environment and such, how exchange rates and stuff can really affect our organisation, how that unknowing or that additional complexity or risk can affect the way our industry operates. It might mean that you guys are looking to source more locally. It may mean you feel like there's an opportunity to go to a country that you hadn't even considered before. Lots of organisations now looking at focusing their potential spend in Turkey and China because that won't be as affected by what's going on with the European Union at the moment. Okay, so you might use, for your 3 tools for market analysis, I generally would be talking about SWOT for your internal, Porter's 5 forces for the micro, your industry, and then steepled for the larger environment that you're looking at. Now then, the next one that we need to talk about is supplier evaluation. Now then, supplier evaluation is a very interesting use of words in the learning outcome. When they talk about supplier evaluation, there are a number of terms that they could use when discussing this. So supplier evaluation is one. Supplier selection is another. And that's a really important word when it comes to tips. Whenever they talk about selection criteria or supplier selection, they're talking about this supplier evaluation. Another terminology is supplier appraisal. Okay? Supplier appraisal. The other terminology that they talk about is pre-qualification. So there are lots of different terminologies they use. What are they all referring to? This ability for you within that cycle to make sure you've got suppliers that can meet your current and future needs. Suppliers who are capable of making sure that you're only working with a supplier list that can do what you're going to ask them to do. Please, please, please take on board, this is not to do with choosing your suppliers. This is getting a pool of suppliers that you can choose from. Okay? That's why it's here before the tendering process, before the managing. It's that process of doing that. If you're in the public sector, you might call it selection questionnaire or pre-qualification questionnaire. If you're in the private sector, it might be the idea of getting suppliers on your preferred supply list, doing your due diligence, making sure that they're pre-qualified, making sure that you've got suppliers that if I go to them, I know that they're going to be safe, they're going to be secure, they're going to have the capacity to meet my needs. Okay? So we'll talk about supplier evaluation. We'll talk about supplier selection. We'll talk about supplier appraisal. We'll talk about... Those are all the same things. Okay. So when we talk about supplier evaluation, it's making sure that suppliers can meet your current and future needs. Here we'll talk about things like the making sure that they've got the financial capacity to meet your needs. Here we'll do things like credit checks on your suppliers. We'll check that they've got a turnover that's sufficient to meet the size of the contract. You might check their profitability to make sure you're not worried that they're not going to make enough profit to continue. Their liquidity, make sure they've got cash flow. Make sure that they've got enough money to buy stuff to meet our order book requirements. Okay, so we'll talk about supplier evaluation in regards to financial capacity, production capacity, their quality assurance. So do they have things like ISO 9000? Can they make sure that they've got the quality processes that we can trust? Their environmental criteria, making sure they've got an environmental policy and criteria that meet the requirements for our organisation and what we're trying to achieve from a strategic level. Remember, everything we're asking for should come down from what our organisation top level is trying to achieve. We'll talk about things like their ability to meet our customers' needs in regards to the systems or the processes that they've got in place. So do they have the technology that we need them to have? There's lots of different tools we can use for that. Lots of people, I know historically, SIPs often talk about Carter's 10Cs as a template, as a platform to use to make sure that those suppliers are evaluated and make sure that they can meet our future and current needs. Okay. Then we talk about tendering processes. Tendering processes are basically the way that we then award a contract. So selection criteria is supplier evaluation, pre-qualification. Get me that pool of suppliers that I can trust. Award criteria is who am I going to give the contract to? And that's the process of the tendering process. How do I choose from this newly formed pool of suppliers? So when we talk about the tendering process, we need to know some key things. Historically, they've asked questions like, what is the difference between open and restricted tendering? Well, open tendering is a one-stage process. It is open to anybody. It means that anybody can bid. It means that what we do is we get a huge array of different suppliers and we say, you all can bid on it. Now that's great and it's beneficial for a number of reasons. It means that anybody can bid, so small to medium enterprises, those that may not have the resource to maybe have got through the qualification stage because they don't have an accreditation. Doesn't mean that they're not good at what they do, it just means that they don't have that particular accreditation. So it opens up the market. It means that we can get much more diverse bids on what we're doing, maybe more innovation, more creativity. However, there are negative things about using an open tender. So negative things about using an open tender is that it means that there's going to be a lot more administration. They might give you a scenario in the exam where they'll tell you there's a huge array of suppliers and therefore you can say, well, it might not be appropriate for open because administrating that would be an incredibly laborious task and resource intensive. They might say they've lacked innovation, and if they say they lack innovation, you might want to use an open. So it's about understanding from the scenario what they're trying to ask you when it's asking you about something about tendering. So there's open, which is one stage. It means that anybody can bid. Great for innovation, great for letting smaller businesses. However, it can be resource intensive. You are going to get a lot of suppliers that just aren't fit for purpose, that shouldn't probably be bidding, but you've allowed them to. A restricted tendering process is a two-stage tendering process. There is usually a pre-qualification stage and then an invitation to tender stage. So there's a stage where we actually weed out a lot of those that we feel like wouldn't be appropriate. And we can do that in a number of ways, looking at their turnover, their financial capacity, or a lot of the stuff that we would do in this supplier evaluation, this pre-qualification stage. This idea that we ask them, do you have enough production capacity? Do you have an ISO accreditation for your quality? Do you have an ISO 9000 or an ISO 9000 is for quality, ISO 14001 for environmental policies and management system. So do they have a system in place? Just so we talk about it, all the ISOs that we generally look at are what we call management systems. So when we ask for an ISO, what we're really asking for is, do you have a management system in place? And all the ISOs, depending on the number, are just different types of management system. So the ISO 9000 is what we call a QMS, a quality management system. And what we're really asking for is, do you have a management system to manage your quality? When we talk about 14001, that's what we call an EMS, an environmental management system. So it's this idea of making sure, if in a restricted stage, that it's a two-stage process and there's a pre-qualification stage before they get through to that main stage of actually bidding. And that means that we don't have to go through the whole bid process. It means that often it can be automated, that, you know, if you're using an e-tendering system, that if people do not have the particular criteria, that they can be automatically removed from the process, which might speed up time in the process, etc. Okay, so the tendering process, we need to know about the different types. There are a number of different best practice tendering procedures. There's the true best practice tendering procedure, which is, there's a 10-stage model I know in your VLE. I know in this slide deck, and the slide that I think I'm going to look at later on today is a 7-stage. It doesn't really matter which one you use. The SIPS rule of 5, they'll generally ask you for 5 different stages of the of the tendering process. Ooh, important thing to mention there. The amount of people that get asked about the sourcing process or the procurement cycle and talk about the tendering process, and the amount of people that get asked about tendering and talk about the procurement cycle or the sourcing process. Please be very, very, very exacting. If it asks for the sourcing process, it's asking for these. Okay? And if it asks for the tendering process, have I just gone past it? Yeah, it's asking for these. They are two very different things. The tendering process fits within the sourcing cycle. Okay. Go back to that. Right, okay. So the tendering process, really important that you understand what the stages of the tendering process are. You can use the best practice 10 stages, or you can use 7. But as I say, just make sure you know at least 5 of the stages, because it's a question that they've asked, and it's quite actually interesting. They asked it on the old syllabus, and we've seen from the sample paper that they've asked it already for on this syllabus. Okay. So tendering process, and I'll quickly go through the slide of all the different stages, but first of all, understand what type of tendering you're going to need. Then if it's open or restricted, etc. I would expect you guys to know maybe some of the other ones like competitive dialogue and negotiation, just because historically those have been the 4 primary types they talk about. They've never asked questions on competitive dialogue or competition, but maybe worth knowing what they are. In regards to the next stage, once you understand what type, you probably want to look at the criteria that you're going to be measuring it on, understanding who's going to be measuring it. Make sure that you then send everything out and it's sent out in a fair and transparent way. I know I've missed the stage where it says about developing the documentation, but don't worry. Then you get the bids in, there might be a debrief. Get those 5 stages that you guys want. This being a revision session, I don't want to talk about every single aspect of every single thing. If there's a list for you to learn, generally it's a learn the list. Okay. Then we've got supplier and stakeholder management. Well, the first thing I would say about any kind of question that you've got this word stakeholder in, there are a few key things that I'd expect you to know. I'd expect you to know a definition of a stakeholder. And a definition of a stakeholder is anybody with a stake or vested interest in the organisation. Okay, so that can be pretty much anybody. I'd expect you to be able to tell me there's 3 different types of stakeholders: internal, external, and connected. Internal stakeholders are those that represent the organisation, so employees, managers. External stakeholder is anybody who is external to the organisation, and that can be the government, lobby groups, and it also includes those that are connected. So external is a wider term, that anybody external to the business, but there are some of those external stakeholders that are a bit more closely impacted by our organisation, that are more affected by our operations. They are connected in some way to us, and that might be a commercial connection. We generally talk about it being a commercial connection. So they might be affected monetary wise by our operations. So we generally talk about, from those people who are outside of our business that might have more of an interest in what we do: suppliers, customers, banks, people that lend us money. Okay. So lots of different stakeholders. Make sure you know some different stakeholders. The key things that we generally talk about are interests. What are their interests? What is the power that they've got? And for that, we generally use a Mendeley stakeholder map. Really important to know that. It would not surprise me if they asked you to discuss the engagement strategy, or discuss the level of power and interest at supplier and how this might affect you in the procurement process. So if they ask you anything about stakeholders, interest and power, or they ask you about mapping stakeholders, the keywords that they might look for, then I'd expect you to be able to do a Mendeley stakeholder map. I've got the slide coming up, so we can talk about that in a second. How do we manage our suppliers and stakeholders? Well, we engage with them appropriately. So from Mendeley, we should keep some of them informed, keep some of them satisfied, keep some of them close. We might ignore some. But then what are the tools? What are the actual mechanisms for engagement? Well, it might be meetings. It might be how do we engage with our suppliers? It might be meet the buyer events. Or potential suppliers, it might be meet the buyer events. How do we engage with our current suppliers or current vendors? Well, it might be things like setting them KPIs, SLAs, having continuous improvement meetings with them. How do we engage with our customers? It might be through marketing. It might be through early customer involvement, getting them involved in the specification. How do we engage with the government? Well, it might be regular communication, updates. It might be our financial accounting records. So we've got to think about those that practical aspect of engagement and how we actually go about that engagement. Okay. So, I think generally that you will get a question generally about these. They have historically asked the question, historically, name some stages of the sourcing cycle, and then in brackets the procurement cycle. So, I'm afraid to say, guys, it's a list. You're going to have to learn it. Generally, they usually use the term identify, which is always nice, because once they say identify, they know they only need the most basic of descriptions and explanations in regards to the level of the specification, etc. So you just have to say step one of the procurement cycle is this. Step 2 is this. Very little explanation needed, because they're just asking you to identify it. So I'm afraid to say, guys, you're gonna have to learn this. Defining the needs. So things that define the need can be identified in a number of different ways. We talked about requisition, and I've put some of the characteristics that would be required on a requisition, because that is what you're going to need. Because this is a video, guys, feel free to pause it, make notes, whatever. You've probably paused it and rewinded it 100 times asking what the hell he said. Okay, but there we go. Port's 5 forces. There has been historically questions in old syllabuses, and this kind of it fits the bill. This kind of thing they might ask. Make sure that you know each of the 5 forces. Have examples in your head. Distinction level answer would probably go both ways, and talk about a market that has very little competitive rivalry. Whenever you talk about competitive rivalry, I would expect the word market structure in there. For you to tell me about how the market's structured, whether or not there are lots of suppliers or not a lot of suppliers. For example, Coca-Cola and Pepsi is what we call a duopoly or an oligopoly, where there are very few suppliers. I would expect you to be able to tell me that something like stationery might have a perfect competition when we talk about the market structure. Lots of suppliers, lots of different lots of different options. Perfect means that everything is the same. The goods are homogeneous. So this idea that everything is the same. So yeah, I'd know your market structures. I would know monopoly, oligopoly or duopoly. We generally use interchangeably, both where you've got a couple of big players, 2 or 3 big players, maybe more like the energy markets. But there's a few big players in the market that dominate that market. I'd expect you to know about imperfect competition, also known as monopolistic competition, where there are lots and lots of suppliers, but they all sell slightly different goods. Things like hatchback cars, which makes it slightly more difficult for us, but we've still got the power as a buyer because there's loads of suppliers, but it means that we've got to make concessions and really understand exactly what we need. If you guys are buying a hatchback car, there's lots of considerations that you have to make. It's not that easy. You know, you've got to decide whether or not you're bothered about the brand or the particular model, or whether you're bothered about air conditioning or power steering or climate control. There's lots of things that we have to decide upon. Then we talk about perfect competition. That is perfect because there isn't that difference in the goods. We can talk about this idea that, you know, it's perfect. We have perfect information. We know exactly what's going on. We can get suppliers to beat each other up. So competitive rivalry, I'd expect you guys to talk to me about market structures, understanding how much competition there is, and the type of competition that exists. When we talk about perfect competition, it's generally price-driven competition. If we talk about things like duopolies, oligopolies, it's about differentiation. It's about the brand. Think about Coke and Pepsi. It's nothing about price. They'll never beat each other up on price. Why? Because it's not in their financial interest to do so. So how do they win business? They try and do it on brand. Okay. Threat of new entrants. I'd expect you guys to give me, again, examples of an industry that might have a high threat of new entrants and a low threat of new entrants. Here, I would be very upset as an examiner unless you used words like barriers to entry, because threat of new entrants is dependent on the barriers to entry. What is stopping somebody else doing it? Coke and Pepsi, huge barriers to entry. You've got your setup costs, the brand that they've got, the infrastructure, their buying power on their raw materials. It's going to be really hard to enter into that market. Stationery, not that much. You'll know probably if you've ever had to buy stationery, you're not really bothered about where you buy it from. It's just who's got the best price, and therefore, there's, anybody can come. They're not inhibited by brand. They're not inhibited by a lot of the things that affect businesses already. I could set up a stationery company. I could buy a load of stuff from China, get it drop shipped in, store it in a container and sell it on eBay. It would be very low barriers to entry for me to go into that market. Okay. Threat of substitutes. What is the threat of somebody coming in and doing something that might take that business away? Again, different industries. It's very difficult for people in restricted markets like monopolies, because if there was an alternative, it might have already come together. It might be a perception in the marketplace. It might be something like switching costs or something that makes it very difficult to substitute that for something else. You think about industries where it's quite, there might be substitutions and how they deal with it. In Coke and Pepsi, you might substitute to an energy drink, so they might buy energy drinks, or their competitors. Think about Coke buying innocent smoothies, Coke buying Monster and Relentless. These are ways that they can fight that. When you think about other businesses that have suffered from substitutions. The watch industry generally, when mobile phones came out, there was a huge sway of people substituting their product for just using a phone instead. When the Channel Tunnel opened, it was from flights. People substituted from flying to using the train. So this idea of understanding that the threat of substitute is something that needs to be considered, what it is. It's somebody doing something that's different but might take away that business. You got the power of buyers. When Porter suggested the power of buyers, he was not discussing the power of buyers within your organisation or the organisation for Coke and Pepsi. He was talking about the power of buyers in regards to the people who buy from the organisation. So for Coke and Pepsi, their buyers are Tesco, and the big four, the supermarkets, the fast food restaurants. Those are their customers. So how much power do the buyers have who are buying their products? Well, for Coke and Pepsi, probably not that much. It's an emotive brand. They have to stock it. Whereas stationery, how much power do the stationery buyers have? Loads, because they can switch, they can change, and it's fairly easy. Okay. When we talk about the power of the suppliers, how much power do Coke and Pepsi's suppliers have, for example? Well, probably not that much. Coke and Pepsi have huge buying power. They're not buying particularly unique goods, generally things like sugar, aluminium, fairly not too difficult to buy. So they're going to have a lot of the power. Whereas in stationery, if you want to be a stationery supplier, you probably don't have a lot of power with your suppliers, because they are brand orientated generally. It might be Sharpies or it might be Bics, but Bics and Sharpie are going to have a much more control and power than you, because they've got lots of customers, and if they don't sell it to you, they'll be able to sell it to someone else. So just make sure that you understand each of those. Try and give examples to show that you have a good understanding of the Porter forces. Okay. Supplier evaluation, as I said, is that pre-qualification, that understanding what suppliers. We can use words like pre-qualification, supplier appraisal, selection criteria, supplier selection. Okay, and we might do that by doing things like site visits, audits, meetings. That's how we generally do that. We might do things like credit checks. We might do things like get their financial records and look at their turnover. Okay. Whenever we talk about pre-qualification, we generally request lots of information to make sure that we can check those things like their financial capability, their production capability, their quality processes, their environmental processes. We might look at their historical capabilities and get references, but these are all things that we might ask for within that pre-qualification stage. The tendering process, sorry guys, just going to have to learn it. Fairly common question. I used to ask it a lot in the old syllabus. The old syllabus and new syllabus not too dissimilar, so it's very much a question that could be asked. When we talk about stakeholder and relationship management, remember that stakeholders are anybody with a vested interest or stake. When we talk about one particular range or group of stakeholders, our suppliers, we generally talk about the level of engagement, the level of interest, the level of power that they have will be dependent on the type of relationship that we have or want to have with that supplier. So when we talk about the type of relationship we want to have with the supplier, we generally talk about the relationship spectrum. The fact that it's talked about supplier and stakeholder management is something that I would know. I know nobody likes to hear you've got to learn a list, but I always remember this as AAT, CSO, SPC. So AAT, adversarial arm's length transactional, CSO, close tactical, single sourced outsourced, and then strategic alliance partnership, co-destiny, SPC. So AAT, CSO, SPC is the way that I would normally go about learning that. And then obviously the engagement, the interaction, the level of trust, the level of information exchange will all increase when we talk about people being at this closer type of relationship. How do we engage with our stakeholders? How do we make sure that we keep those relationships on target? Well, we might do things like face-to-face meetings, telephones, using things like body language, those non-verbal communication tools that we might have. Do they look distressed? Do they look anxious? We might use things like active listening. Now, these are all communication tools. Active listening is like the evolution of listening. There's generally, when we talk about listening, we talk about 3 types of listening. We talk about passive listening, which is when we talk to somebody but it's going straight over their head and there is nothing going in. And I get that a lot in the classroom when I look around. When we talk about acknowledgement, or we talk about the idea that people nodding and taking on board but not questioning it. Whereas active listening is the idea of questioning and showing true understanding. So if I was to say something like the supplier should be able to deliver by the 17th, somebody go, oh, right, okay, great. But an active listener would say, what do you mean should? So you question it, you summarise, you'd make sure that you were truly getting on with what was being said. Okay, supplier and stakeholder management. How do we do that? How do we make sure our suppliers are keeping up to their end of the bargain, that they're doing what they're meant to be doing? Well, we set them KPIs, we have regular reviews, but audits, SLAs. Okay. When we talk about understanding our stakeholders, I think this is probably the most important slide that you guys will come across, this idea of understanding your stakeholders and their relative level of power and interest. So this is Mendelow's stakeholder mapping. And he generally discussed it as being things like depending on the level of power that they have. So how much power do they have to influence your organization? Maybe change your strategies, change your processes, drive the way that you operate, and how much interest, how bothered are they? So you can be very interested in an organization but have very little power to affect it. Lots of the staff within all of your organizations, maybe including yourselves, have a lot of interest in ensuring that the organisation continues to operate in a profitable manner because you've got mortgages or you've got bills to pay. Whereas the level of power you have to influence the direction and scope of the business might not be that high. So just make sure that you do that. Obviously, there'll be a scenario that you'd have to say where the person fit within there. One thing I would just quickly say, one of the things about managing our suppliers in particular, it's important to know about KPIs. Please make sure that if you talk about KPIs, you talk about them being smart, specific, measurable, agreed, relevant, and time-bound. There's different variations of SMART, I know. It might be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. Depending on which textbook you pick up, you'll get those different variants, but make sure you know our variant of it. Make sure that you know that KPIs can be quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative are numerical-based KPIs, whereas qualitative are more subjective. We tend to use quantitative for buying goods, how many were delivered, how many defects. We tend to use qualitative for services, how satisfied, how did you feel the relationship was, were they responsive to us. So make sure you know that. Generally, if they ask you to name 5 KPIs, which they've done on other modules, so they could do it on this, you would generally talk about the 5 rights, making sure you've got, you might have a KPI around making sure that they're charging what they're meant to be charging, they're competitive in the market in regards to price, quality, how many defects, timescales, etc., etc. Okay, so that's pretty much learning outcome 1. So I'll pause my video now and I'll hopefully that's explained everything that you need, or gives you a little bit of guidance on some of the things that they might ask and how they might ask it. If anybody's got any questions, obviously you guys will all have tutors that you're operating with in the moment. Feel free to communicate to them, and if there's anything else you need, please do not hesitate to contact us.